The 10th of May, 1940, dawned grey and ominous over London as Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill stood at the threshold of 10 Downing Street, accepting the burden that would define civilization's darkest hour. While German panzers crashed through the Ardennes forest with terrifying speed, systematically dismantling Allied defenses that military strategists had declared impregnable, the 65-year-old politician inherited a nation teetering on the precipice of annihilation. Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had crumbled like ash, and now Churchill, the man whose warnings had been dismissed as warmongering for nearly a decade, found himself summoned to salvage what many believed was already lost. The German High Command, flush with their blitzkrieg victories across Poland, Denmark, and Norway, calculated that Britain would seek terms within 3 weeks of France's inevitable collapse. Adolf Hitler himself told his generals that the island nation, stripped of continental allies and facing the most formidable military machine ever assembled, would recognize the futility of resistance. German intelligence reports emphasized Britain's military unpreparedness. The British Expeditionary Force trapped in France, the Royal Air Force outnumbered, and the Royal Navy spread desperately thin across global commitments. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry had already prepared victory announcements confidently predicting that Churchill's government would fall before summer's end, replaced by pragmatic politicians who understood that negotiation, not destruction, served British interests. But Germany's assumption rested on a fundamental miscalculation about the man who now held Britain's fate in his weathered hands. Churchill had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, though he could never have imagined its terrible dimensions. Born into aristocracy at Blenheim Palace in 1874, he had served as both soldier and statesman, witnessing the Boer War's brutality firsthand, commanding men in the trenches of the Great War, and navigating the treacherous currents of imperial politics for 4 decades. His career had been marked by spectacular failures, Gallipoli haunted him still, and remarkable comebacks that demonstrated an almost supernatural resilience. According to historians referenced in Andrew Roberts' comprehensive biography, Walking with Destiny, Churchill possessed an unshakable conviction that Britain represented something transcendent, a beacon of parliamentary democracy and individual liberty that must not be extinguished from the earth. Where others saw hopeless military statistics, he perceived moral imperatives that transformed mere survival into sacred duty. His romantic nationalism, forged in Victorian certainties about British exceptionalism, might have seemed anachronistic to the appeasers who dominated Parliament, but it would prove to be precisely the spiritual armor Britain needed. On that fateful May morning, as Churchill assembled his war cabinet, reports flooded in of German armies pouring through Belgian defenses like a steel flood. The Dutch government prepared for evacuation. French commanders, their strategic doctrine shattered by mechanized warfare's unprecedented velocity, issued contradictory orders that accelerated the chaos. King George VI, who had reluctantly accepted Chamberlain's resignation, watched his new prime minister with undisguised concern. Churchill had enemies throughout the political establishment. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, barely concealed his preference for negotiated peace, while conservative backbenchers remembered Churchill's decades of political apostasy and unpredictability. Yet Churchill understood something his critics did not. This war would not be won through conventional military calculations alone. It would be decided by will, by the refusal to accept what appeared inevitable. As he prepared to address Parliament for the first time as Prime Minister, he knew his words must accomplish what British arms could not yet achieve. They must transform despair into defiance, must kindle a flame of resistance that no darkness could extinguish. The Germans expected capitulation. Churchill would give them something altogether different, a declaration that would echo across continents and down through generations, redefining what one small island nation, standing utterly alone, might dare to attempt against overwhelming odds. The 13th of May, 1940, arrived with catastrophic news from the continent that would have broken lesser leaders before they even began. Belgium teetered on collapse, the French Ninth Army had disintegrated near Sedan, and the British Expeditionary Force faced encirclement. As Winston Churchill rose to address the House of Commons at precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, Members of Parliament crowded into the chamber with expressions ranging from desperate hope to barely concealed hostility. Many conservatives still mourned Chamberlain's departure, viewing Churchill as an unstable adventurer whose romantic notions about British destiny would lead the nation to pointless destruction. The Labour benches, while supporting the change in leadership, harbored deep suspicions about Churchill's aristocratic background and his controversial history with trade unions. Churchill stood at the dispatch box, his round figure draped in the black coat that had become his signature, his face set in that peculiar combination of determination and melancholy that photographers would immortalize. He did not offer comfort. He did not promise easy victory. Instead, he delivered words that struck the chamber like hammer blows. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The phrase, borrowed from classical rhetoric but transformed by Churchill's genius for dramatic compression, hung in the air like a battle standard. Where Chamberlain had spoken of peace in our time, Churchill promised suffering. Where others might have sought to minimize the crisis, he amplified it with brutal honesty. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind, Churchill continued, his voice deepening with emotion. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. Conservative members shifted uncomfortably. This was not the rhetoric of leadership they expected. No platitudes about British pluck seeing them through. No assurances that right makes might. Churchill was describing a descent into hell, and he was asking them to follow him willingly. His policy, he declared, was to wage war by sea, land, and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. The language carried biblical weight, transforming military conflict into cosmic struggle. According to contemporary accounts preserved in parliamentary records, the chamber fell into profound silence as Churchill approached his peroration. His aim, he stated with absolute clarity, was singular. Victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. These were not the words of a politician hedging his bets, preparing excuses for inevitable compromise. They were the words of a man who had looked into the abyss and chosen to challenge it. German intelligence officers, reviewing translations of the speech within hours, dismissed it as delusional rhetoric from a desperate has-been. The Wehrmacht was advancing 30 miles per day across terrain the French had considered impassable. Britain possessed no meaningful land army capable of challenging German supremacy. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the Royal Air Force by significant margins. Hitler's response, when informed of Churchill's defiant tone, was reportedly one of bemusement. Let the old man have his speeches while German divisions carved up Europe. But the speech accomplished something that military analysts could not quantify. It established the psychological framework for sustained resistance. Where Chamberlain had sought accommodation with evil, treating Hitler's territorial demands as legitimate grievances requiring diplomatic resolution, Churchill named the enemy plainly. This was not a border dispute or an unfortunate misunderstanding between nations. This was, he insisted, a monstrous tyranny that threatened civilization itself. By framing the conflict in existential moral terms rather than geopolitical calculations, Churchill made surrender not merely strategically unwise but spiritually impossible. Members of Parliament left the chamber that afternoon transformed, though many could not yet articulate what had changed. Churchill had not promised them victory, he had promised them only suffering and sacrifice. Yet in that brutal honesty, they found something more valuable than false hope. They found permission to believe that resistance itself, regardless of outcome, possessed inherent worth. The speech lasted barely 13 minutes, but those 800 words restructured British consciousness. As evening fell and German armies continued their relentless advance, Churchill's message began radiating outward through BBC broadcasts, newspaper reprints, and word of mouth. The Germans had calculated on British pragmatism. They had not calculated on Winston Churchill's ability to transform pragmatism itself into a form of moral cowardice. By the 26th of May, 1940, The military situation had deteriorated beyond the worst nightmares of British planners. The German Army Group A, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt, had reached the English Channel at Abbeville, effectively severing the British Expeditionary Force from the main French armies to the south. Over 300,000 British and French troops found themselves compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket around the coastal town of Dunkirk, their backs to the sea, facing complete annihilation. In London, the War Office prepared for the worst. Staff officers calculated that perhaps 30,000 men might be evacuated before the pocket collapsed, meaning that Britain would lose the core of its trained army in a single catastrophic blow. Winston Churchill confronted a crisis that would have justified immediate peace negotiations. Lord Halifax, still serving as Foreign Secretary despite his preference for Chamberlain's approach, argued forcefully in war cabinet meetings that Britain should explore Italian mediation to reach an accommodation with Germany before the military situation rendered negotiation impossible. Halifax represented substantial opinion within the government and the broader Conservative Party, men who believed that Churchill's defiant rhetoric, however stirring, could not alter the mathematical realities of German military superiority. They pointed to the smoking ruins of Rotterdam, destroyed by Luftwaffe bombers after the Dutch refused immediate surrender, as evidence of what awaited London if Britain continued this futile resistance. According to John Lukács's authoritative account, 5 Days in London, May 1940, these war cabinet debates represented the true crisis point of the war, more consequential even than the later Battle of Britain. If Halifax and his faction had prevailed, if Churchill had been outmaneuvered politically and replaced by a government willing to negotiate, the entire trajectory of world history would have shifted irrevocably. The United States, still deeply isolationist under the Neutrality Acts, would have had no European ally through which to eventually engage Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union, still bound by the Nazi-Soviet Pact signed in August 1939, would have faced Hitler's eventual invasion without any Western front to divide German attention. Churchill understood these stakes with perfect clarity. He fought Halifax not with military plans, there were none that offered hope, but with moral arguments that transcended immediate circumstances. In a crucial war cabinet meeting on the 28th of May, Churchill asked his colleagues to consider what terms Hitler might offer. The Führer would demand, at minimum, the return of former German colonies, British acquiescence to German domination of Europe, and likely the dismissal of Churchill himself and installation of a compliant government. But Churchill pressed further. Could Britain trust Hitler to honor any agreement? Had not Hitler violated every treaty he had signed, from the Versailles Settlement to the Munich Agreement to his recent guarantees of Belgian neutrality? More fundamentally, Churchill argued that Britain's honor and civilization itself required defiance regardless of military calculation. He invoked the nation's history, reminding his colleagues that Britain had faced seemingly insurmountable odds before, against the Spanish Armada in 1588, against Napoleon Bonaparte, against every tyrant who assumed that British resolve could be calculated through battlefield arithmetic alone. This was not mere rhetoric. Churchill genuinely believed that some defeats were preferable to dishonorable survival. Better that London burn than that Britain become a vassal state, its parliament reduced to a rubber stamp for Nazi decrees, its empire dismembered to serve German interests. The debate raged through those critical late May days while at Dunkirk. British and French soldiers dug defensive positions in the sand dunes and waited for deliverance that seemed impossible. The German army had paused its advance on the 24th of May. Historians still debate whether Hitler ordered this halt to spare German armor for the coming French campaign, whether Göring convinced him that the Luftwaffe alone could destroy the trapped armies, or whether Hitler deliberately allowed the British Expeditionary Force an escape route, hoping that this mercy might facilitate later negotiations. Whatever the reason, the pause provided a window of opportunity that Churchill, demonstrating the decisive risk-taking that characterized his leadership, immediately exploited. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, began on the 26th of May with modest expectations and desperate improvisation. The Royal Navy assembled every vessel that could reach the shallow beaches, destroyers, minesweepers, Passenger ferries, fishing boats, and hundreds of civilian craft crewed by weekend sailors who crossed the channel into artillery range and dive-bombing attacks. Churchill did not oversell the operation. He understood that evacuation, however successful, represented military defeat. Yet he also recognized that preserving the army preserved Britain's capacity to continue the fight. Each soldier brought back across the channel was a seed of future resistance, a trained man who would form the nucleus of rebuilt divisions. As ships shuttled back and forth under German bombardment, Churchill prepared to address Parliament again, knowing that he must define Dunkirk in ways that prevented military defeat from becoming psychological collapse. The 4th of June, 1940, found Winston Churchill once again before the House of Commons, this time to explain what ordinary citizens were already calling the miracle of Dunkirk. Over 338,000 troops, far exceeding the War Office's most optimistic projections, had been evacuated from the beaches in 9 days of desperate shuttling across the Channel. The operation had cost the Royal Navy 6 destroyers sunk, 19 damaged, and over 200 civilian vessels lost. More critically, the British Expeditionary Force had abandoned virtually all its heavy equipment. Over 2,000 artillery pieces, 64,000 vehicles, 76,000 tons of ammunition, and 400,000 tons of supplies now equipped German divisions. Britain's army had survived, but it had been stripped of the material means to fight. Churchill faced a delicate rhetorical challenge. He needed to acknowledge the military disaster honestly, while transforming the evacuation into a moral victory that would sustain British resolve. The temptation to oversell Dunkirk as a triumph must have been enormous. The press was already lionizing the little ships and the extraordinary courage displayed in the evacuation. But Churchill, demonstrating the judgment that separated him from conventional politicians, refused to let relief obscure reality. He began his speech with a detailed accounting of the military situation, explaining precisely how the German breakthrough had occurred and what Britain had lost. "Wars are not won by evacuations," he stated bluntly, denying his audience the comfort of illusion. Yet having established brutal honesty about the military facts, Churchill pivoted to the deeper meaning of Dunkirk. The evacuation, he argued, revealed something essential about British character: the improvisation, the courage of ordinary civilians who sailed their pleasure boats into combat zones, the Royal Air Force pilots who fought themselves to exhaustion providing cover, the soldiers who maintained discipline under horrific conditions. According to Martin Gilbert's official biography, Churchill had worked through multiple drafts of this speech, laboring to find words that would capture both defeat and defiance simultaneously. He succeeded brilliantly. "We shall go on to the end," Churchill declared, his voice building toward the peroration that would define his leadership and Britain's war. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be." The repetition of "we shall fight" became hypnotic, each phrase building upon the last like waves crashing against a shore. Conservative members who had doubted Churchill's appointment, who had considered him a dangerous romantic, found themselves swept into the rhythm of his words. Churchill continued, expanding his vision of resistance to encompass every possible battleground. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The final phrase, "we shall never surrender," rang through the chamber like a cathedral bell. Labour members, who had initially supported Churchill primarily as Chamberlain's replacement, began to recognize that they had not merely changed prime ministers but had found a leader whose vision matched the crisis's moral dimensions. Then Churchill added a final element that revealed both his strategic realism and his understanding of psychological warfare. "And even if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old." This was message aimed not just at British ears, but at American ones. Churchill was telling Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the isolationist United States Congress that Britain would fight regardless, that the Atlantic Ocean would not protect America if Britain fell, that Nazi Germany would eventually threaten the Western Hemisphere itself. German intelligence analysts, monitoring the speech through various channels, dismissed it as more empty rhetoric from a government whose military position remained hopeless. Wehrmacht planning documents from early June 1940, preserved in German military archives, reveal supreme confidence that Britain would sue for peace once France formally capitulated. The German General Staff calculated that Churchill's government would collapse under the weight of military reality within weeks, replaced by more reasonable politicians who understood that Britain's strategic position was untenable without continental allies. But the Germans fundamentally misunderstood what Churchill had accomplished. He had transformed the very definition of victory. Traditional military logic suggested that Britain, stripped of allies and facing an enemy controlling resources from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, had already lost. Churchill redefined winning as sustained resistance itself, making surrender the only true defeat. By this measure, every day Britain continued fighting constituted victory, regardless of battlefield outcomes. This psychological reframing proved as significant as any military strategy. The 22nd of June, 1940, dawned with grim finality as French representatives signed surrender documents in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had accepted armistice terms ending the Great War 22 years earlier. Adolf Hitler's deliberate choreography, compelling French defeat in the very location of German humiliation, symbolized the complete reversal of 1918's outcome. France, the great continental power whose army was considered Europe's finest in September 1939, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. From the Pyrenees to the Low Countries, from the Atlantic to the Alps, Nazi Germany now controlled territory containing over 150 million people and industrial capacity exceeding Britain's by substantial margins. Winston Churchill received the news in his underground cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, the bomb-proof bunker that would serve as Britain's nerve center for the next 5 years. He had traveled to France repeatedly during the collapse, meeting with French Premier Paul Reynaud and attempting to stiffen French resolve. But he had ultimately witnessed firsthand the complete psychological disintegration of French leadership. The French government, after relocating from Paris to Tours to Bordeaux in panicked succession, had finally accepted that continued resistance meant national destruction. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun from the Great War, emerged as the advocate for armistice, arguing that France must preserve something of itself rather than fight to annihilation. Britain now stood utterly alone against Nazi Germany. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, pledged continued support, but they were scattered across the globe, separated from Britain by thousands of miles of ocean. The United States maintained official neutrality, constrained by the Neutrality Acts and a powerful isolationist movement that insisted that European wars were not America's concern. The Soviet Union remained Germany's de facto ally under the Nazi-Soviet Pact, shipping raw materials to fuel the Wehrmacht's war machine. Throughout occupied Europe, from Norway to Belgium to France, Nazi administrators consolidated control while Gestapo officers hunted resistance members. According to Andrew Roberts' research drawing on recently declassified materials, the German High Command expected Britain to recognize its hopeless position within weeks of French surrender. Planning documents for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, were drafted not as serious military undertakings, but as contingency plans for the unlikely scenario that Britain proved irrational enough to continue fighting. Hitler's actual expectation was that Churchill would either be deposed by pragmatic politicians or that he would finally acknowledge reality and accept German hegemony over Europe in exchange for preserving Britain's independence and empire. Churchill addressed the nation by radio on the 18th of June, in one of his most critical broadcasts. The BBC had arranged for his speeches to reach not just Britain, but occupied Europe and, crucially, America. Churchill spoke directly into the microphone, his distinctive voice, simultaneously aristocratic and somehow earthy, carrying across the airwaves. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. He was naming the coming struggle, giving it form and meaning before it even commenced. The speech marked a subtle but significant evolution in Churchill's rhetoric. Where his parliamentary speeches addressed colleagues who understood military affairs and political nuance, his radio broadcasts reached ordinary citizens facing blackout curtains, rationing, and the very real prospect of German invasion. Churchill did not condescend to this audience. Instead, he elevated them, treating every listener as a stakeholder in civilization's survival. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, he intoned. Upon it depends our own British life, and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. Then came the passage that defined Churchill's entire worldview. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The phrase, their finest hour, captured Churchill's romantic nationalism perfectly, the belief that nations, like individuals, faced moments of testing that revealed essential character. He was arguing that how Britain conducted itself in this crisis mattered more than the immediate outcome, that moral courage possessed its own species of victory, independent of battlefield results. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels responded to Churchill's speech with mockery, broadcasting messages in English that pointed to British military weakness and isolation. German radio announcers assured listeners that Churchill was leading Britain to destruction, that the British people would eventually recognize his rhetoric as empty bombast and demand new leadership. Lord Haw Haw, the British-born Nazi propagandist William Joyce, broadcast detailed accounts of German military strength and British vulnerability, his sneering voice designed to undermine morale. But Churchill's speeches were accomplishing something that German analysts failed to recognize. They were constructing a narrative in which Britain had already won simply by refusing to surrender. Every factory worker who showed up for another shift, every pilot who climbed into his Hurricane or Spitfire, every housewife who maintained her household despite shortages, all became participants in historic resistance. Churchill democratized heroism, making it available to everyone rather than the exclusive province of battlefield commanders. As summer began and German forces assembled along the French coast, preparing potential invasion, Britain transformed itself into a fortress. Church bells were silenced so they could serve as invasion warnings. Signposts were removed to confuse German parachutists. The Home Guard, initially called the Local Defense Volunteers, enrolled over 1 million men too old or too young for regular service, armed initially with little more than pitchforks and shotguns, but embodying Churchill's insistence that Britain would fight for every street and field. By the 13th of August 1940, the Luftwaffe launched Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, the comprehensive air campaign designed to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding Germany's air forces, confidently predicted that 4 days of intensive operations would eliminate British fighter defenses, allowing German bombers to devastate British industry and infrastructure at will. Over 1,300 German aircraft, Messerschmitt 109 and 110 fighters, Dornier and Heinkel bombers, Junkers, Stuka dive bombers, began systematic attacks on British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The Battle of Britain, which Churchill had prophesied, had begun in earnest. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding commanded Fighter Command from headquarters at Bentley Priory, orchestrating Britain's defense with resources that seemed catastrophically inadequate. The Royal Air Force possessed fewer than 700 operational fighters, primarily Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires, to defend the entire nation against numerically superior German forces. More critically, Britain was losing pilots faster than training programs could replace them. Young men, many barely 20 years old, were flying 4 and 5 sorties daily, climbing into their cockpits exhausted from previous combat, knowing that statistical probability made their survival unlikely. Flight surgeons prescribed Benzedrine to keep pilots alert and whiskey to help them sleep, creating a pharmaceutical cycle that pushed human endurance beyond natural limits. Winston Churchill visited Fighter Command headquarters repeatedly during August and September, watching the operations room where Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters pushed symbols across large maps. tracking incoming raids detected by the radar stations that provided Britain's crucial early warning system. According to Churchill's own account in the Second World War, he witnessed one particular day when nearly every available squadron had been committed to combat. The reserves exhausted, and still German bombers continued approaching. When Churchill asked doubting what reserves remained, the air marshal replied simply, "None." Churchill later wrote that this represented the most frightening moment of the entire war. The realization that Britain's defense hung by a thread so thin that one more major raid might snap it entirely. Yet the Luftwaffe failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that German planning assumed. Multiple factors contributed to this failure, each revealing flaws in German intelligence and strategic doctrine. German bombers, designed primarily for supporting ground operations rather than strategic bombardment, lacked sufficient range, bomb capacity, and defensive armament for sustained operations over Britain. The Messerschmitt 109 fighters, though excellent aircraft, operated at extreme range when covering bombers over southern England, allowing only minutes of combat time before fuel considerations forced their return. British pilots, fighting over their own territory, could bail out and return to combat. German airmen who survived being shot down became prisoners. More fundamentally, the Luftwaffe kept changing objectives. After initially targeting radar stations, the logical choice for eliminating Britain's defensive advantage, German commanders shifted to attacking airfields, then aircraft factories, then fatefully to bombing London itself. This final shift resulted from a British bombing raid on Berlin conducted in retaliation for German bombs accidentally falling on London. Hitler, enraged that British aircraft had reached the German capital, ordered Göring to devastate British cities. The decision, driven by rage rather than strategic calculation, relieved pressure on fighter command's strained airfields and allowed Dowding to repair and rebuild. Churchill addressed Parliament on the 20th of August, 1940, delivering a speech that named the struggle and honored its participants with characteristic eloquence. After reviewing the military situation comprehensively, Churchill turned to the young fighter pilots upon whose skill and courage Britain's survival depended. The gratitude of every home in our island, in our empire, and indeed throughout the world, except in the abodes of the guilty, goes out to the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase "the few" instantly entered British consciousness, becoming the eternal designation for the pilots who flew that summer and autumn. Churchill had achieved something remarkable. He had given language to sacrifice, making the abstract concept of national defense concrete through words that honored individual courage. Young men who might have been forgotten statistics became the few, their actions elevated to mythic status while they still lived. This was not mere propaganda. Churchill genuinely felt profound gratitude and awe toward these pilots, but it served propaganda's highest function, making visible the heroism that might otherwise pass unnoticed in the chaos of war. German intelligence continued to misread the battle's progress. Luftwaffe officers, reviewing their bomber crews' reports of destroyed British airfields and downed fighters, concluded that British resistance was near collapse. In fact, British aircraft production, galvanized by Minister of Aircraft Production Lord Beaverbrook's ruthless efficiency, was actually outpacing German production during the critical summer months. British fighter squadrons, though exhausted, maintained operational capacity. The invasion barges assembling in French and Belgian ports never received the order to sail because the Luftwaffe could not establish the air superiority that Operation Sea Lion's planners considered prerequisite. By late September, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely, though this decision remained secret. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing of British cities, the Blitz, attempting through terror bombing to break British civilian morale. London burned, as did Coventry, Plymouth, Birmingham, and numerous other cities. Over 40,000 British civilians would die in the Blitz before it finally ended in May 1941, when Hitler redirected the Luftwaffe eastward for Operation Barbarossa. The 7th of September 1940 marked the beginning of the Blitz as 300 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, crossed the Thames estuary in broad daylight and struck London's East End docks with devastating effect. The bombing continued through the night as subsequent waves dropped incendiary and high-explosive bombs across the capital. Fires raged through working-class neighborhoods where densely packed housing offered no protection from blast or flame. By dawn, over 400 Londoners lay dead, with 1,600 seriously injured. This was merely the opening act of a 57 consecutive night bombardment that would test Churchill's promise that Britain would endure whatever the enemy inflicted. Winston Churchill insisted on witnessing the destruction firsthand, against the protests of his security detail. He traveled through bombed neighborhoods while fires still burned. His distinctive figure, the black coat, the cane, the ever-present cigar, becoming a symbol of defiant resilience. Photographs from this period, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, show Churchill standing amid rubble, sometimes making his famous V for Victory sign, sometimes simply standing silent as rescue workers dug through collapsed buildings searching for survivors. These were not staged photo opportunities. Churchill genuinely drew strength from direct contact with ordinary Londoners, enduring what he had asked them to endure. The East End bore disproportionate suffering during the early Blitz. Working-class families lacked access to private shelters and crowded into the underground stations that had been reluctantly opened as public shelters. Churchill visited these improvised refuges, where thousands slept on platforms and in tunnels. Children nested between strangers, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and chemical toilets. He met factory workers still showing up for shifts despite bombed homes, mothers who had lost children but refused to evacuate those who survived, elderly pensioners who remembered Zeppelin raids from the Great War and insisted this was no worse. According to Hastings Ismay's memoirs, Churchill was profoundly moved by these encounters, recognizing that ordinary citizens were demonstrating the courage he had demanded in his speeches. But he also faced criticism that revealed class tensions within British society. Why were working-class neighborhoods bombed nightly, while wealthy areas of West London suffered less? Why did the royal family and government officials have access to reinforced shelters, while East Enders made do with Anderson shelters? Corrugated iron structures in gardens that offered minimal protection? Churchill addressed these concerns in multiple ways, increasing shelter provision, ensuring that Buckingham Palace remained occupied despite bombing. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth famously refused evacuation, and consistently framing the Blitz as a shared ordeal affecting all Britons. German strategy behind the Blitz reflected evolving military thinking. Unable to achieve air superiority sufficient for invasion, unable to destroy fighter command through daylight operations, the Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. Destroy British industrial capacity, disrupt transportation networks, break civilian morale, and ultimately force Churchill's government to sue for peace. Goebbels' propaganda emphasized the bombing's effectiveness, broadcasting exaggerated claims about British industrial paralysis and civilian panic. German newsreels showed flames engulfing London, implying imminent British collapse. Reality proved far more complex. British industrial production actually increased during the Blitz as factories dispersed operations and workers demonstrated extraordinary dedication. Transportation networks, though disrupted, proved remarkably resilient. Bomb craters were filled, rails repaired, and services restored with impressive speed. Civilian morale, rather than breaking, seemed to harden with each attack. Social researchers conducting surveys during this period, documented in Angus Calder's The People's War, found that the bombing actually strengthened resolve, rather than undermining it. The shared suffering created solidarity across class lines, while German attacks validated Churchill's characterization of Nazi Germany as barbaric, and Britain's resistance as morally necessary. Churchill's rhetoric evolved to meet the Blitz's demands. His radio broadcasts acknowledged the suffering, but framed it within the larger narrative of resistance. When Coventry was devastated on the 14th of November 1940, with over 500 civilians killed in a single night of bombing, Churchill visited the ruins and spoke to survivors with visible emotion. He promised that Germany would pay for these crimes, that British bombers would eventually repay the destruction inflicted on British cities. This was not merely vengeful rhetoric. Churchill genuinely believed that strategic bombing of German cities would become militarily necessary and morally justified by German actions. The German decision to bomb cities rather than maintain pressure on airfields and aircraft factories represented a crucial strategic error. Fighter Command gained breathing space to repair airfields, rest pilots, and integrate replacements. British aircraft production continued to outpace losses. The Luftwaffe's night bombing proved far less accurate than daylight operations, with many bombs falling on non-military targets or missing urban areas entirely. German bomber losses to British night fighters and anti-aircraft defenses steadily mounted, and the Luftwaffe lacked sufficient reserves to sustain indefinite operations. By December 1940, informed observers could recognize that Germany had failed to break Britain. The invasion that Churchill had prepared to resist would not come, at least not that year. Hitler's attention was already turning eastward toward the Soviet Union, his ideological obsession and perceived need for Lebensraum outweighing the strategic logic of finishing Britain first. Churchill could not yet know this, but he could sense that Britain had survived its most dangerous period. The Germans had believed Britain would surrender within weeks. 5 months later, British cities burned, but the nation endured. The 22nd of June, 1941, transformed the war's entire character when German forces launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops advancing across a 1,000-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Winston Churchill received the intelligence reports confirming the invasion with complex emotions, relief that German attention had shifted from Britain, understanding that the war's scale had exponentially expanded, and grim determination to embrace an alliance with Soviet Russia, despite his lifelong anti-communism. That evening, Churchill broadcast to the nation, explaining that Britain would support the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany, regardless of ideological differences. If Hitler invaded hell, Churchill reportedly told his secretary, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. This pragmatic flexibility demonstrated Churchill's essential character. He was romantic about British civilization and parliamentary democracy, but ruthlessly practical about military necessities. He had spent decades warning about Bolshevik danger, had intervened against the Bolsheviks during Russia's civil war following the Great War, and had no illusions about Joseph Stalin's brutality. Yet he immediately recognized that Nazi Germany represented a greater threat to Britain's survival than Soviet communism. The alliance with Russia, however ideologically uncomfortable, divided German forces and created the two-front war that offered Britain pathways to eventual victory. The German invasion of Russia vindicated Churchill's strategy of holding out through 1940's darkest days. Had Britain surrendered or negotiated peace following France's collapse, Hitler would have concentrated his entire military power against the Soviet Union. Instead, Germany now fought on two fronts while also committing forces to North Africa and maintaining occupation garrisons across conquered Europe. British bombers struck German cities nightly, forcing the Luftwaffe to maintain air defenses that could otherwise support operations in Russia. Royal Navy vessels blockaded German shipping, strangling imports of raw materials. Most critically, Britain provided a staging ground for the eventual liberation of Western Europe, a role that would prove essential once America entered the war. The 7th of December 1941 brought news that completed the transformation Churchill had worked toward since May 1940. Japanese aircraft attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, bringing the United States into the war against Japan, and consequently against Germany and Italy through the Axis alliance. Churchill, upon hearing the news, experienced what he later described as the greatest relief of his life. "So we had won after all," he wrote in his war memoirs. Britain's survival through 18 months of isolation had preserved the one scenario that offered certain victory: American industrial and military power committed to defeating Nazi Germany. Churchill traveled to Washington by battleship that December, meeting President Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the first of numerous wartime conferences. The two leaders formed a partnership that, despite tensions and disagreements, would coordinate Allied strategy through the war's remainder. Churchill addressed a joint session of the United States Congress on the 26th of December, receiving a standing ovation when he referenced the Japanese attack. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? According to historian David Reynolds in From World War to Cold War, Churchill's speeches to American audiences served multiple purposes simultaneously. He was rallying American opinion to support the Europe First strategy that gave priority to defeating Germany before Japan. He was cementing the Anglo-American alliance that he viewed as essential not just for winning the war, but for structuring the post-war world. He was also, quite consciously, positioning Britain as America's indispensable European partner, despite the obvious disparity in power between the fading British Empire and the rising American superpower. German leaders, monitoring these developments, recognized that their window for decisive victory had closed. The rapid conquest of the Soviet Union that German planners had anticipated became instead a brutal war of attrition as Russian forces retreated, regrouped, and counterattacked. German armies advancing toward Moscow encountered winter weather for which they were catastrophically unprepared. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg tactics, so effective in Poland and France, ground to a halt in Russian mud and snow. Meanwhile, American factories began converting to war production, their output dwarfing anything Germany could match. Churchill's role evolved as the war expanded. He was no longer simply the leader of an isolated nation facing invasion, but a key architect of global Allied strategy. He traveled constantly to Cairo, to Moscow, to Casablanca, to Tehran, meeting with Roosevelt and Stalin, coordinating military operations, arguing strategic priorities, and always maintaining pressure on Hitler's fortress Europe. His speeches continued to inspire British endurance through years of continued sacrifice, but now they promised eventual victory rather than mere survival. The speeches from 1940 remained Churchill's defining moments, however. When historians assessed his leadership, they consistently returned to those first desperate months when Britain stood alone. His offer of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His insistence that wars are not won by evacuations. His promise to fight on beaches and landing grounds, his tribute to the few. These words had accomplished what German military analysts thought impossible. They had transformed a strategically hopeless situation into a crusade, had made resistance itself a form of victory, and had bought the time necessary for the wider alliance that eventually crushed Nazi Germany. The German miscalculation about British surrender revealed fundamental misunderstandings about democratic societies and the power of moral leadership. Hitler and his generals assumed that pragmatic calculation of military odds would drive British decision-making. They failed to account for Churchill's ability to reframe the conflict in civilizational terms that made surrender psychologically impossible, regardless of military circumstances. They assumed that bombing would break civilian morale, not understanding that shared suffering could create solidarity rather than panic. Most fundamentally, they underestimated the power of words to shape reality. By 1942, with American forces arriving in Britain and Soviet armies holding before Moscow, the war's outcome was no longer in serious doubt, though years of brutal fighting remained. Churchill continued as Prime Minister, guiding Britain through campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and finally, on the 6th of June 1944, the Normandy invasion that began Western Europe's liberation. He attended the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where the post-war order was negotiated, and witnessed Germany's unconditional surrender on the 8th of May 1945, exactly 5 years after he had become Prime Minister. The 8th of May 1945 arrived with church bells pealing across Britain for the first time in 6 years, as Winston Churchill announced Germany's unconditional surrender. Crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square and along Whitehall, chanting Churchill's name, demanding that the Prime Minister who had led them through civilization's darkest passage emerge and acknowledge victory. Churchill appeared on the balcony of the Ministry of Health building, tears streaming down his face, making his famous V for Victory sign to the roaring masses below. "This is your victory," he told them, but the crowd shouted back, "No, it is yours." In that moment, the compact forged 5 years earlier reached completion. The leader who had promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat had delivered what he never guaranteed: survival and victory. Yet history's judgment on Churchill's 1940 speeches transcended military outcomes. Scholars examining the period, including John Lukács in his definitive studies, consistently concluded that those words accomplished something more profound than tactical military advantage. Churchill had articulated principles about civilization's worth, about when compromise becomes collaboration, and about the inherent value of resistance against tyranny, regardless of immediate prospects. These were not merely political speeches but philosophical statements about human dignity and national character. The German expectation of British surrender within weeks reflected reasonable military calculation based on 19th-century strategic thinking. Nations fought until military defeat became inevitable, then negotiated terms that preserved what could be preserved. Churchill rejected this logic entirely, arguing instead that some struggles transcended calculation, that maintaining honor and principle mattered more than survival purchased through capitulation. This was not irrational romanticism. Churchill understood military realities perfectly, but rather a competing rationality that valued civilizational preservation over immediate national interest. Hitler's failure to comprehend this distinction cost Germany the war. Had Churchill been replaced by Halifax or another appeaser in May or June 1940, Britain likely would have accepted a negotiated peace that acknowledged German hegemony over continental Europe. Germany could then have concentrated entirely on the eventual invasion of Russia, quite possibly defeating the Soviet Union, before American intervention became decisive. The entire trajectory of the 20th century hinged on Churchill's speeches maintaining British resolve during those critical months when surrender appeared rational. The speeches also established templates for democratic leadership during existential crises. Churchill demonstrated that effective wartime leadership required absolute honesty about dangers combined with unwavering confidence in eventual triumph. He never minimized the enemy's strength or the sacrifices required, yet he never doubted ultimate victory. This combination, realism about costs, idealism about outcomes, created a psychological framework that sustained civilian morale through years of hardship. Modern political leaders facing crises still study Churchill's rhetorical techniques, recognizing that he discovered profound truths about how language shapes collective will. British casualties during the war exceeded 450,000 dead, with countless others wounded physically or psychologically. British cities bore scars from bombing that remained visible decades later. The economic cost bankrupted the empire, forcing Britain to accept American loans that took generations to repay, and hastening decolonization that dismantled the imperial system Churchill had cherished. Victory came at catastrophic price, validating German predictions about the costs of resistance. Yet Churchill's fundamental argument proved correct. Surrender would have cost more than victory. A Britain that negotiated peace in 1940 would have survived physically but died spiritually, reduced to a satellite state orbiting Hitler's new order. Parliamentary democracy would have withered under German pressure to eliminate Jewish influence and suppress anti-German sentiment. The empire would have been dismembered on German terms rather than dissolved through negotiated independence. Most significantly, Britain would have forfeited its self-respect, its claim to moral leadership, its entire historical narrative about standing against tyranny. Churchill lost the general election of July 1945, defeated by a Labour Party landslide that reflected British desire for social reform after years of wartime austerity. He accepted defeat graciously, recognizing democratic legitimacy even when it meant his own rejection. He returned as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, but his second term focused primarily on Cold War diplomacy rather than domestic policy. He retired from Parliament in 1964 and died on the 24th of January, 1965, receiving a state funeral that honored his wartime leadership, with pageantry Britain reserves for monarchs. The railway carriage where French surrender had been signed in 1940, the same carriage where German surrender had been accepted in 1918, was destroyed by SS troops in 1945 as Allied forces approached, eliminating the physical symbol of German humiliation and French defeat. But Churchill's speeches from 1940 cannot be destroyed. They exist as permanent recordings, as printed texts studied in schools worldwide, as quotations invoked whenever free peoples face authoritarian threats. "We shall fight on the beaches" requires no context. Their finest hour needs no explanation. "Never surrender" transcends its specific historical moment. German strategic planning in May 1940 was not fundamentally flawed. Britain's military position was genuinely hopeless by conventional measures. A rational calculation of forces, resources, and strategic position suggested that negotiated peace served British interests better than continued resistance. The Germans were not wrong about the military facts. They were wrong about Winston Churchill's capacity to make facts subordinate to will, to transform a political community through rhetoric that appealed to its deepest values. The story of Churchill's first months as Prime Minister, therefore, is ultimately a story about the power of words to shape reality. He did not command great armies in May 1940. Britain's army was trapped at Dunkirk. He did not control economic resources exceeding Germany's. Britain was outmatched industrially. He did not possess diplomatic cards that made British victory likely. Britain stood alone. What Churchill possessed was language, and he wielded it with such skill that he converted military weakness into moral strength, transformed isolation into principled independence, and made survival itself a form of victory. The Germans thought Britain would surrender in weeks. Churchill's speeches proved them catastrophically wrong, not because words stopped panzers or grounded Luftwaffe bombers, but because words sustained the will to resist until military circumstances changed. 5 years later, when German forces surrendered unconditionally and Hitler lay dead in his Berlin bunker, that initial miscalculation stood revealed as the decision that cost Germany everything. Churchill had promised to fight to the end. The end, when it came, found Britain still standing, bloodied but unbroken, its honor intact, and its prime minister vindicated. That was the shock Churchill delivered, not military surprise, but the iron determination that some nations under certain leaders simply will not surrender regardless of odds. Germany discovered this truth too late to alter its course, and the discovery destroyed Hitler's 1,000-year Reich in just 12 years.